Hello everyone, I am Chandana Alavattage and welcome to my second lecture on content analysis. In my previous lecture, we discussed the nature of the data that a content analysis would normally deal with. And we also explained how content analysis can be explained and justified within the context of duality between reality and the textualized reality. Having such a conceptual understanding of the topic, now in this lecture we are moving towards the technical and procedural aspects of doing a content analysis. And our specific attention in this lecture will be on quantitative content analysis. In the next lecture, we will discuss qualitative content analysis. So, as usual, let us begin this lecture by explaining our learning objectives. After following this introductory lecture, and as I explained in the previous lecture, after reading the recommended material for this lecture, you should be able to understand the manner in which the key elements of your research process are defined and framed by the use of a quantitative content analysis. That is our learning objective 1. And the learning objective 2, you should be able to design and explain your research project using the methodological parameters of a quantitative content analysis. So those are the 2 learning objectives. So this lecture will be organized around the key elements of your research process. That means we will try to discuss and explain and understand how the use of content analysis would frame each of the key elements of your research process. Now, when we are specifically thinking about the quantitative content analysis, I would identify following key elements of the research process. Then we can think about how each of them would be framed or defined by the methodological parameters of content analysis. So these are the key elements of your research process. The first element is defining your research problem. So you will start your research process by defining your research problem. And second one is defining your research hypothesis, or in other words, translating your research problem into either one or a set of research hypotheses that you are going to test using quantitative content analysis. And third step or third element of your research process is defining your variables, explaining and defining the variables that constitute your hypothesis. And then comes the defining your sample or the set of secondary data that you are going to analyze in order to test your hypothesis. And then the next element is, or next step is, defining your coding process or the analysis process. How do you carry out your coding or the analysis process? And then how do you use statistics in order to test your hypothesis? So in other words, the process through which you test the hypothesis. And then the last step is, how do you report your analysis and findings? So we will follow these steps to see how each of these steps will be defined and framed by the use of content analysis. And in explaining each of these steps, and in explaining how content analysis frame and define each of these steps, I will use an example, a journal paper published in a good accounting journal, so that you can easily see how those authors in that particular paper operationalize content analysis in defining and framing each of these elements. So that's the way we are going to explain quantitative content analysis, or the technical and procedural aspects of doing a quantitative content analysis in this lecture. Now, let us discuss the first element of the research process: defining research problem. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, the definition and clarification of research problem is the ideal starting point of a good research. A good research would normally start with a well-defined, well-clarified, and well-explained and well-focused research problem. So, your dissertation or your research project should explain your research problem in the very first chapter, the chapter 1. So, in explaining your research problem or in clarifying your research problem, you have to understand that there is a connection between the manner in which you explain your research problem and the methodology you would choose. And inversely, your methodological choice depends on the specific reality problem or the research problem that you are going to understand, explore, and explain. So this connection between the research problem and methodology is a very important element when you are trying to explain and define your research problem. I can give you an example, very simple, very generic example, but it is a very powerful example to illustrate the point. Now, if you are going to explore a new galaxy or a new planet or a new star up there in the sky, you can't use a microscope. You have to use a telescope. Similarly, if you are going to study the internal structure of a blood cell, you can't use a telescope. You have to use a microscope. So this simple example tells how the methodology depends on the problem that you are going to study or the reality condition that you are going to explore and explain. So therefore, when you are going to explain and define your research problem, you have to keep in mind that you have to make this connection between the methodology and the reality or the problem clearer. It can be explicit or it can be implicit, but you have to locate your research problem within the duality between or connection between the methodology and the reality problem. So this is a fact that is applicable irrespective of the methodology you use. Whatever the methodology you use, your methodological choice depends on the problem. And the manner in which you explain your research methodology depends on your problem. And inversely, the manner in which you explain your research problem depends on the methodology you are going to use. Now, when it comes to the content analysis, as I already mentioned in my previous lecture, the conceptual lecture, the content analysis or the justification of content analysis stems from the duality between the reality and the textualized reality. So we mentioned that the content analysis specifically deal with the data that the reality itself create, and those data are by nature qualitative. So therefore, you have to make sure when you are defining your research problem, you have to make sure you locate and explain or contextualize your research problem within this duality between the reality and the textualized reality, within the connection between reality and the textualized reality. Now, if I take an example, as I mentioned earlier, so I will explain all these research steps or the research elements, and how the content analysis frame these research elements by using an example, a journal paper. So the paper I selected for this particular lecture is the paper that Smith and Tefler published in Accounting, Auditing and Accountability Journal, or AAAJ, which is a very well reputed and well recognized high ranking accounting journal and a peer reviewed accounting journal. So therefore this particular paper, the Smith and Tefler's paper, provide a good example of how to use the quantitative content analysis. That doesn't mean you have to only follow this paper. No, there are so many other papers you can go and read, and they all would be very, very helpful. But incidentally, I happen to choose this particular paper because I feel it's a good paper to explain the quantitative research process in content analysis. So here is the paper by Smith and Tefler. Now, Smith and Tefler think about a specific reality condition. To repeat it again, to emphasize it again, what I said earlier, when you are defining the reality or research problem in the content analysis, you have to locate your research problem within the duality between reality and the textualized reality. So for Smith and Tefler, there is a specific reality condition that they want to explore, which is the financial risk of bankruptcy. We all know that companies go bankrupt. Simple example, a recent example is Thomas Cook. And companies going bankrupt is not an ideal situation. It is a problematic reality. It's a problematic condition that we being the accounting scholars and finance scholars should explain, try to explain. So this is Smith and Tefler wants to study that in this paper. So that is the reality condition they want to study. The financial risk of bankruptcy. As we know, the reality gets textualized into different forms. Now, in the case of financial risk of bankruptcy, the corporate reporting practices, corporate management is organized in such a manner they have to textualize their perceptions, their assessment, their understanding of the possibilities of companies facing significant risk in different ways. So they have to report their assessment of financial risk in various forms. It may be in company website, annual reports, and even some newspapers or news medias will provide some data, and some independent studies can provide the data, and even the auditor's reports may provide some textualization of this possibility or this reality, that is the risk of financial risk of going bankrupt. But however, one of the most important critical practice of textualizing this reality is the chairman's review or the chairman's statement. So Tefler and Smith and Tefler locate their problem within this duality between the reality, financial risk of going bankruptcy, and the chairman's statement. So they want to see the association between these two conditions, the actual possibilities of a bank or a company going bankruptcy, and the manner in which that particular company textualized that possibility in the chairman's review. So how far the chairman's review can reveal, can associate, can predict the actual possibility of a company going bankrupt. So that is the particular research problem that this paper wants to study. So here is the manner in which they put it down, they wrote it. So they says, this paper is concerned explicitly with the question of whether the firm's discretionary narrative disclosures are able to measure financial risk of bankruptcy, which is as they say, a key dimension of concern to annual report users. Whether it is investors, any other readers, they are really concerned about whether this particular company go bankrupt. Yes, that's a very important thing that the people have to know. So they say, specifically, we explore the association of the chairman's statement along with subsequent corporate failures. So the reality, the corporate failure, the bankruptcy. The textualized reality, chairman's review. How the chairman's review reveal, textualize this possibility. So that is the manner in which they explain their problem. So the key point, if you are trying to define, or when you are defining and clarifying your research problem, with the idea of using the content analysis as your research methodology, you should try your best to locate the research problem within the duality between the reality and the textualized reality. So in which sense you might be talking about an association, connection, causality between these two elements, the reality and the textualized reality. Once you clarify your research problem, you need to translate your research problem or problems into a set of hypotheses or hypotheses. That is because the quantitative content analysis is a positivistic research approach. Very often, normally, the quantitative content analysis uses the doctrines of hypothetico-deductivism in making the particular knowledge claim that the researcher is going to make. So in other words, a researcher who uses quantitative content analysis ultimately make his or her knowledge claim on the basis of testing a set of hypotheses or a single hypothesis, depending on the nature of the research problem that the particular researcher deals with. As I already explained, when we are articulating our research problem, we should locate or we explain our research problem within the duality between real and the textual. And this connection between the reality and the textualized reality should be mobilized in a similar fashion, even when you are explaining and articulating your research hypothesis or hypotheses. So, both the research problem and your hypothesis should be explained within the connection between your real and the textual. And it is this particular connection between these two elements that you hypothesize. That is the connection that you want to test. And by testing that connection between these two, you are going to make a knowledge claim. And that connection, depending on the manner in which you understand the reality, and depending on the way you read the existing literature, and depending on the manner the existing literature talks about this particular connection between the real and the text that you are dealing with, that connection may be conceptualized either as a causality, or as an association, or as a predictability, or, depending on the situation, any other sort of connection. So either way, your hypothesis should manifest a connection between the real phenomena that you are going to study and the text that particular real phenomena is related to. So it is same as the research problem. You simply translate it into hypothesis or a set of hypotheses. Now, let us go to our example, Smith and Tefler's paper. So as we already discussed, when we are explaining their research problem, so they are talking about the two specific connection between a real and a text. The real is the possibility of financial risk of bankruptcy, and the text is the chairman's statement, or in other words, narrative or discretionary accounting disclosures. So they want to see this particular connection. So within that particular context, they understand that they have a bigger and overall proposition to test. So that proposition is that the discretionary narrative accounting disclosures have explicit information contents associated with the financial risk of bankruptcy. That's what they mention. So that is the overall proposition that they want to test. So they understand, they believe, they presume, or they hypothesize in a broader sense that the discretionary narrative accounting disclosures have explicit information contents associated with the firm's financial risk of bankruptcy. That is the proposition they want to understand, articulate, or test. So in order to test that, based upon their specific methodological approach, so based upon the specific manner in which they operationalize their content analysis or the quantitative content analysis, they set two hypotheses. As I will further explain when I am talking about coding process or the analysis process, so these two authors, Smith and Toffler, think about the content analysis in two different forms. One they call the form-oriented analysis, and the other one they call the meaning-oriented analysis. So there is a form-oriented content in the chairman's review, and there's a meaning-oriented content in the chairman's review. So that is the way they organized, that is the way they conceptualized and operationalized their content analysis. So on the basis of that particular differentiation between two types of codes or two types of analytical elements, the form-oriented and the theme-oriented. So they set two distinct but interrelated hypotheses. The first hypothesis is related to the form-oriented content, and they read it as a combination of keywords and phrases from the chairman's statement derived from a form-oriented content analysis is associated with the company failure. So they are emphasizing the idea that there is a specific set of contents which are form-oriented, and they can predict to a certain extent the possibilities of financial risk of bankruptcy. Then the second hypothesis is related to their second element of the content analysis, that is a theme-oriented or a meaning-oriented analysis. So they say themes apparent from a meaning-oriented content analysis of the chairman's statement are associated with the company failure. So these are the two hypotheses that they are testing. To summarize, you need to translate your research question into set of hypotheses or a single hypothesis if you are going to use quantitative content analysis as a positivistic research approach. And when you are articulating your research hypothesis, you need to pay the attention to the connection between the real and the text. Once you translate your research problem into a set of hypotheses, you need a statistical model or a framework to test it. And such a statistical model or a framework should include at least three key interrelated elements. The first one, a set of variables, dependent and independent variables, into which you conceptualize the hypothesized relationship or a causality or association in your set of hypotheses. Second one, you need a specific statistical equation into which you organize these variables so that you can specifically use a statistical technique to test those hypotheses. And third element, you need a sample from which you collect the data in order to operationalize this statistical framework. As we discussed earlier, in a content analysis, we basically deal with qualitative secondary data. And if you are going to use quantitative content analysis, as we mentioned earlier, you need to translate this qualitative secondary data into numerical or quantitative data so that you can use statistics to test a hypothesis. And the variables are the statistical basis upon which this translation or conversion takes place. So the variables translate qualitative secondary data into numerical data. So it is these variables in your model that provide a specific value for these qualitative content of your content analysis. So such variables therefore should be derived, that such variables should be taken out from the content that you are analyzing. Now, if we go back to our example, Smith and Tafler's paper, as we already discussed, they want to test the association between the financial risk of bankruptcy and the manner in which the chairman's statement is worded. So in this association between the reality and the textualized reality, so they see financial risk of bankruptcy as the dependent variable. Their definition of this variable, or in other words, the manner in which they define this dependent variable, is related to the other two key elements I just mentioned. The statistical formula or equation that you are going to use, or the statistical techniques that you are going to use, and the sample through which you collect the data. Now in their case, so they have a sample of companies in which there is a half of the companies are financially good, financially viable, solid companies. And half of the companies are financially bankrupt or financially bad companies. So they have a paired set of companies. One bankrupt company paired with a good, solid, financially healthy company. So they calculate a Z value, a particular score, through which they understand the financial health of these particular two companies. So those companies, the bankrupt companies, as their Appendix 1 explains in their paper, you can go and check it. So in the Appendix 1 in the paper, they explain all these bankrupt companies have a negative Z score, and the good companies have a positive Z score. So by comparing these two sets of companies, so they can have what they call a discriminant analysis. They can differentiate between high-low financial risk companies. So that is the manner in which they constructed their dependent variable. So yet again, when you are defining your variable, in this case your dependent variable, you define it on the basis of the specific statistical technique that you are going to use, and possibly with the help of the sample that you are going to use. So in either way, in your statistical model, you need a set of variables, and that variables has to be associated with or connected to the statistical technique that you are going to use and the sample that you are going to use. Then, what about the independent variables? In this example, the independent variables are related to the manner in which this chairman's statement is worded. So they believe that the manner in which, or the differences in the way the chairman's statement is worded should be able to explain the dependent variable the financial risk of bankruptcy. The Z score differences between the companies in the sample. So therefore, the independent variable should come out from the way you read or way you code or way you analyze this chairman's statement. So therefore, the manner in which you code your data provides you the basis upon which you define and clarify your independent variables. Now in this example, they talk about two hypotheses. One hypothesis is related to the form-oriented reading or form-oriented coding of the data. And the next one is related to the meaning-oriented or the theme-oriented reading of this data, as I mentioned earlier. Now, therefore, the independent variables are constructed on the basis of this coding differentiation, the meaning-oriented coding and theme-oriented coding. So, in order to code the secondary data or the qualitative secondary data or the text, they used a specific software package. So they got the help of a specific software package to read this massive set of data so that they can identify specific keywords and the specific themes. So that program was Oxford Concordance Program. The Oxford Concordance Program is a specific software which can read and analyze the massive textual data, and it can generate word list, indexes, and concordance, etc. So using that software, so they initially generated 168 keywords. So they have a dictionary of keywords, 168 keywords generated by the use of the particular software. Then they reorganized these keywords into two categories. The first one is the meaning-oriented or theme-oriented categories. And the other one is the form-oriented categories. So therefore, they have two sets of variables here, the form-oriented variable and the theme-oriented variable. So they define these form-oriented variables and theme-oriented variables regarding each key word using a particular formula. So these are the two formulas they are using to define their two categories of variables. And in addition, they also have some conceptual categories into which all these 168 variables are reclassified and defined. So for example, in the case of form-oriented coding, form-oriented variables, they have these specific categories into which all other 168 category of keywords are being reorganized. So here is the table. So this table illustrates the manner in which they constructed their independent variables related to the form-oriented coding, form-oriented analysis. And similarly, this paper or this table illustrates the manner in which they reorganized their theme-oriented variables. So in a broader sense, what do you see here? The identification of independent variables in a quantitative content analysis mainly stems from the manner in which you read the text or you code the text. So depending on specific differences in the coding practice you deploy, you can categorize or you can have different categories of variables, independent variables. In this case, they have two categories of independent variables, form-oriented independent variables and the meaning or the theme-oriented independent variables. And they want to see as their hypothesis is related to these two differentiation to see whether these form-oriented variables can explain the financial risk of bankruptcy or the Z score. And similarly, they want to explain their second hypothesis whether these theme-oriented variables can explain the financial risk of bankruptcy. So that is the manner in which they constructed their variables. And that construction of variables, to repeat it again, depends on the specific statistical techniques and tools that you use and the manner in which you define and use your sample. So these are all interrelated elements, the variables, samples, and the statistical techniques that you use. So that constitute the statistical framework to be used to test your hypotheses. And by testing such a hypothesis, you establish your knowledge claim. Now, let us talk a little bit more about the coding process. As I already mentioned, coding process is the key or the fundamental analytical process of a content analysis. And as I already mentioned, coding process involves identification of salient, defining or characterizing words, concepts, themes, instances, occurrences, and so on. And such a coding process can take two different approaches. The first one is bottom-up approach, and the second one is top-to-bottom approach. And these two approaches are not mutually exclusive. They are mutually inclusive. As in the case of our example papers, you can use them together in a single content analysis. Now, let's start talking about the bottom-up coding approach. In the case of bottom-up coding approach, you start from the text itself, empty-handed, empty-minded. So you will not have any priori or preconception of the codes that you are going to look for. So you have a set of text here and you have a large text here. So you are going to analyze that large text in order to identify some salient key concepts, themes, and keywords. But you don't know yet what these keywords are going to be. And you have not identified these keywords on the basis of any priori theory or the literature. You haven't. So you don't have any idea about what the codes are going to be. So empty-handed, empty-minded, you start reading the text, either manually or with the help of a computer software. Then you see certain keywords occur very frequently. So you identify a set of keywords. They are the most dominantly appearing, most salient, most featuring keywords in this particular text. So that is on the basis of the counting or on the basis of reading. You see them appearing everywhere. And you see them appearing as the most salient, dominating, characterizing, and featuring concepts or themes or words. And these, the first order codes, the first order words, first order themes that you identify in such manner from the text itself is called primary codes. So that's the word, primary codes. And then you read further on to understand the connection between these primary codes. So there is a one primary code, say for example code A or word A, and there's another primary code, code B or the word B. And then you are trying to understand the interconnections between these primary codes. So when you are trying to understand the interconnections between these primary codes, then you bring out another set of codes, another set of words, another set of themes, concepts, and so on. And they are called secondary or axial codes. So the secondary or the axial codes are those codes which connects the primary codes. So you are identifying the primary codes and the secondary codes from the text itself. So that is the bottom-up approach. Now in the case of our example, Smith and Tafler's paper, they used Oxford Concordance software program to read the text and to come out with some key words. So that's a bottom-up approach. They were not looking for a specific code in the text, but they are letting the text to generate its own codes. So that is bottom-up approach. Now, on the other hand, the top-to-bottom approach start reading the text with a priori set of codes or pre-conceptualized set of codes. So you are not reading the text empty-handed. You are reading the text to see how a particular pre-conceptualized code appear here, or a pre-conceptualized theme, concepts, keywords appear here. And that pre-conceptualization of the codes are drawn from either existing literature or a theoretical framework. So therefore, you first read the literature. You first read a theory or a set of theories. And on the basis of the existing literature and on the basis of a particular theoretical framework, you see this particular phenomena needed to be explained on the basis of these keywords or these concepts or these themes, these variables. And then you are looking for them in the text. So that is a top to bottom. Top is the theory of the literature. Start from there. Find out a set of key themes and literature. Derive some set of key themes, variables, and so on from the literature. And then go down to see how they appear, how they constitute the text. That is top to bottom reading. Now, for example, Smith and Tafler's case, they also uses this top to bottom reading. They use the literature and they use a particular theory to identify that the theme-oriented or the meaning-oriented coding should be categorized into 4 key variables as I discussed earlier. And that reading is a top to bottom coding practice. Okay, so to summarize, coding is the key or the central analytical element of a content analysis. And it involves identification of keywords, variables, concepts, themes, occurrences, instances, and so on. And that process of identification can be either bottom to top or top to bottom. In the case of bottom to top, you start the process of reading without any preconception of codes. Empty-handed, empty-minded, like a grounded theory approach. And in the case of top to bottom, you start reading and analyzing the text with a set of preconceptualized, theoretically drawn set of keywords, themes, variables, and so on. And you are analyzing the text in order to see how they appear in the text. So that's the difference between top to bottom and bottom to top coding. So you can use either of them or both of them in combination. Now, we are in the last stage of our discussion. That is presentation or reporting of our findings and analysis. How do we report or how do we present our findings and analysis in the case of a quantitative content analysis? As I already mentioned, a quantitative content analysis is a positivistic research approach. It relies upon hypothetical deductivism to make its knowledge claim. In other words, a quantitative content analysis makes the knowledge claim by testing a set of hypotheses. Therefore, the manner in which you would present your findings and analysis is straightforward. So you have to present your analysis and findings along with these hypotheses you have already discussed. So you have a set of hypotheses which talks about a particular causality between dependent variable and a set of independent variables. So you have to tell to the reader using the appropriate statistical tables how far these independent variables can explain the dependent variable. In other words, in your discussion, in your presentation, reporting, you have to explain the extent to which the independent variables or the set of independent variables you have can explain the dependent variable. In other words, you explain their explanatory power using appropriate statistical figures and statistical tables. And thereby you would explain whether a given set of hypotheses or a given hypothesis is accepted or rejected, and if it is accepted or rejected, under which probability levels or conditions. So that's how you present. So you have to present your data or findings and analysis along with hypotheses to explain the explanatory power of the independent variables, to explain the dependent variables, together with the necessary or the required probability levels. And you do that using specific statistical tables. You can look at Smith and Tefler's paper, for example, or any other paper, for example, to see how they do it. However, simply presenting your analysis and findings as a statistical table is necessary but not sufficient. Very often not sufficient. I will repeat it. Such presentation of statistics in tables is necessary but very often not sufficient. You need to discuss their theoretical and the literary implications. So you have run a test, you did a quantitative content analysis, and you use statistics, and you tested a set of hypotheses, and now you have conclusions. So you present this conclusion in a statistical table. Then you have to talk also about what are the theoretical and the literature implications of that analysis. This means you have to bring the literature and the theory into your discussion later on. So you have to have a discussion section or a conclusion section talking about theoretical and the literature, as well as sometimes managerial or policy implications of your findings. So to repeat it again, it is necessary, it is very important to present the statistical information in appropriate manners, but that is not sufficient most of the time. So you have to extend that particular presentation into a discussion and conclusion where you would be talking about theoretical and literary implications as well as managerial and or policy implications of your findings. So that's how you present and discuss your findings and analysis. So let us summarize this lecture. So this lecture was about quantitative content analysis. And in this lecture we discussed the manner in which a quantitative content analysis would define and frame specific or key elements of your research process. So in that sense, we discussed how you should define your research problem in the case of a content analysis, and then how you should translate that research problem into a set of hypotheses. And then thirdly, we discussed how should you construct a conceptual framework or a statistical framework to test that hypothesis, and the key elements of such a conceptual or statistical framework. So we discussed in that context, a statistical framework should constitute variables or the definition of variables and having a statistical formula or an equation or a model to test the hypothesis and selecting a sample and collecting the data through the sample. Then we also discussed the process of coding. The coding process can take place either top to bottom or bottom to up. And finally, we discussed the manner in which you should present your analysis and findings. And all these discussions were illustrated by Smith and Tefler's paper. So it's a good idea to go and read it again to see how you can follow a similar approach in framing your study. So with that summary note, so I conclude this lecture, and we will meet again in our third lecture on content analysis, which is qualitative content analysis. So until that, goodbye.